So there it says support assignment of cashiers to registers by a manager, right? So this is a perfect phrase that tells us, okay, you're dealing with the use case, right? And by who is basically your actor, but of course a specific cashier is just a parameter being used in this specific operation or use case. Basically, in order to be able to assign, we have to have an available cashier, and therefore we can basically tell the register object that now take this cashier ID, and when they log in, right, you will know that they're assigned, and therefore they can log in. Not anyone can log in, but only assigned. So basically it takes two people essentially to process a sale. The manager has to authorize the cashier to log in, and then of course the cashier should be able to log in, and then they can start doing the sales. A cashier can have several assignments issued by one shift. Now this shift keeps appearing over and over and over again in our conversation here. So essentially, I begin to think that the shift could be an object which simply is something like when I move on, perhaps to the next stage, and as I will be thinking about relationship between objects, I can think about maybe. I can think about a cashier, right? It's just a little bit too thick. Cashier, which is an object, right? And shift being basically like a collection of information of, it's like a history of login, logout, information. So there could be that the cashier simply has a collection of this information, or vice versa. It could be that the shift can basically keep track of cashiers in the entire shift. So either way, but at some point it will become clearer. But I just to note that there is this understanding of the shift in the business, and somehow I need to be able to accommodate the shift in my system so that the users will see it someplace on their displays and so forth. The record of each assignment shall be kept and identify the cashier, the register, the manager, the date and time interval, right? So obviously anytime I see a record, this is a signal that this is a persistence issue, that the business requires that we keep record of this collection of information, and we can have, like, when we go to the database, right? So if we're thinking about us using some kind of a database, which is pretty realistic type of thing, right? So when we have the database right here, what we can do is we can support a table of assignments, right? Okay, and this table of assignments will most likely have all this information, the cashier ID, the register ID, then the manager ID, right? Manager ID, and then the dates and times for this stuff and so forth. So usually this is the way you keep track of tables. Basically, the name of the table that stores the records, and then the data fields. And of course, all entities have unique IDs in the database. And of course, you will have like a cashier table with the cashier ID, cashier name of there, and other information. And of course you will have the register table somewhere, register, right, where we have register register ID and other information about the register. So at the persistence layer over here, we may recognize these types of data tables or tables of records that we want to recognize and store, right? So that's just a good way to pay attention to those things and keep this in mind, that this is the information that you need to be able to retain. By the way, anything that gets stored in a database, most likely, not all of it, but a lot of this information will appear somewhere on computer screen, maybe entered by the user, and some of it can be generated by the system. Like these IDs are likely generated by the system and not really entered by any kind of screen, right? But someplace there could be information on screen, but then there could be a business object that contains all this information, and eventually the business object tells the database, okay, let's create this type of record, and this is the set of information, the set of data fields that I want you to retain. Cashier should be disallowed to log into a register without being assigned by the manager. So essentially, this is an example of a precondition. It really doesn't carry on a lot of new information. We already sort of said that, well, there has to be an assignment should be taking place before they can log in. So this is just simply becomes somewhere in our documentation when we describe our use cases. At some point, we will just fill this in as a precondition to a specific use case, which is logging on by the cashier. All right. Support clearing a cashier at the end of the shift, right? So the manager, so another use case clear cashier, and of course this will be another use case that needs to be done by the manager, right? So clear cashier, right? Another type of use case. If we follow our design over here, then we can say that, okay, there's another use case which is available to the store manager, right? So that's how we begin to accumulate information about the system. So moving on. The record of this operation shall identify the cashier, the amount, the date, and the manager, right? So let me see, record of operation. Basically, how should we name this? It could be, essentially, perhaps we can have a table like somewhere, right? We can capture the shift, right? The shift information. It could be a database record, and in this shift information we can say, okay, we have a register, right? We have the register, or basically it can be just the assignment, right? Already an existing assignment record, and there could be basically a log on. And there could be also a field that says cleared by, right? So ID. One manager couldn't do the assignment, another manager at the end of the shift could be already on the floor that does the clearance, right? And so we could be, so I want to scratch this, don't remove it, but scratch it, and instead of thinking about the assignment would be perhaps a good place to store this information. You can see that this is not all hard set and decided yet. I'm just dealing with an idea that this information needs to be stored and retained and everything. And remember, sometimes when I realize what needs to go into the database, this is a really strong and very good foundation to think about business objects, right? So I can have an assignment business object, and I can connect it with the cashier and stuff like this. and this assignment can have pieces of this information, and there could be something that will eventually contribute to my object design. All right. So the record cashier amount, yes. So at the end of at this clearance event, right? So we can say amount, right? Amount of all sales during this assignment, and there's also later on it says if there's any discrepancy, it needs to be recognized. So there could be like discrepancy amount also entered. Right, so that is something that we want to be able to store with the record in the database. All right, so we see who's involved, what amounts are involved, dates and times. So obviously, clearly something that we need to be able to deal with during this business, so that we can keep good books of what we're trying to do with this business. Cancellation of the entire sale. How do I deal with this? Cancellation, it's a bit strange, right? It's not like when we're talking about the cancellation of a sale, it's not like we're we have this cashier who basically will jump into the system and do cancellation of the sale. Basically, cancellation of a sale is a possible scenario during the sale process, right? So cancel sale. All right. The thing is that as we execute this process sale thing, we could be updating some database records, right? So as soon as we basically choose an item, like scan the barcode or enter the item manually, or whatever we do to indicate the items, right? We could be already updating some database information or business objects and so forth. So cancel sale is something which will undo these changes, right? So basically, cancel sale could be what happens is that basically most likely there's a button over here during this case in front of the user, so cashier can actually click the button and invoke this sort of like a sub case, right? Which we call we would say that this is an extension, right? So typically you want to essentially take a note of this, right? And on your diagram, you will say this is an extension. Extend, okay? So what happens is, and you use like a direction in which you extend. So extend in UML use case diagrams, use case extension, is something that says this is optional, right? This may or may not happen. So this is the way the use cases can be drawn and viewed as sometimes you can also have different use case which is also different type of sale, which may be like an online sale, right? And they could also have cancel sale connection. So there could be other ways to organize our use cases and have additional use cases, but obviously this piece is optional. It's not going to happen during each sale, but sometimes we would like to say cancel sale. So we can separate this like this, and obviously it will have its own separate screen, its own separate set of parameters that we need to maybe deal with. Just an observation for this part. That cancel sale is not something that I want to directly connect with the cashier, but rather show as an extension, because clearly that tells me it's optional. So when you see something like this, sometimes it will say extend on the diagram, sometimes it will be just a connection like this, but that tells you that it's optional. Okay, return of an individual item, however, is a separate thing, right? So you see how the user document kind of mixes those two things together, but returning the item is a separate use case, right? So again, this diagram quickly gets crowded because we're dealing with the real system, so to speak, right? So here, return item, right? It's a separate situation. Someone walks to the customer desk, right, and just basically says, I'd like to return the item. Here's my receipt. Here's my credit card. Here's whatever, right? And we say, okay, you can return this item. And therefore, this is very likely to be just a separate use case. However, it doesn't say exactly this in the document, right? It's just something that we try to interpret and use it as distinct pieces of instances of using our system. Keep track of the inventory, right? So I won't even go into much of the drawing or addition to this, but most likely, if I deal with inventory, maybe I want the manager to do this, right? So manage inventory, something like this. So maybe this is a use case specific to the manager. Well, I still have kind of like space on this little diagram to add, so I will add one more, but not more, because obviously there will be also printing reports, perhaps some other types of updates and so forth, but generally speaking, this will grow. But like I said, in this view of the system, you just want to observe what the system does, who does what. These connections indicate who can do what, and of course there could be a relationship between the actors that act in those capacities. All right, so essentially inventory, of course, it also tells me that I will have to have some kind of, this time, keep track. For the most part, I think for the user means having a record, right? A database record of, okay, I have this inventory, so I have product ID, product description, the quantity available, the price, the supplier, and the order, right? So is a separate story. Like I can create orders so that I can pre-order the inventory and therefore update my supplies and everything. So clearly those things will say, we almost forgot this, maybe an object level of analysis here, but clearly many of these things I think inventory is more of a database level qualification of information. At the level of object is basically some kind of an item, right? Basically, during the sale, we want to recognize as maybe like a line item, or generally speaking, just an item that identifies a certain product, right? So a line item inside the sale, but when we manage the inventory, maybe we can say product, right? Product item, something like this, right? And so the product item will have something to do with pricing as well, but the pricing could be a separate table. So items can have IDs, but the pricing not necessarily is. Although right here it says that directly in your inventory you can enter the price. Of course, the ordering price is different compared to the sales price and so forth. So, but you get the idea. Most likely, this price right here is, of course, is not a sophisticated object. This is something that of a quality of just a data attribute, right? So data attribute which we can store inside the product or inside the light item and so forth. All right, so again, this is a bit vague. It's not completely all set and everything, but I'm making some progress, and I think this is one of the things that you should kind of sense that this is very helpful. Surprisingly, it's surprisingly simple and surprisingly helpful to understand. Notice my strategy here is that actors typically identify by noun words, right? Cashier, store manager, and the use cases are typically identified by verb phrases such as log on, process, return item, assign, clear, manage, right? So verb is driving and cancel is of the same capacity, right? So essentially the verb phrases are the way you name your use cases. The verb phrases in the original business description allow you to identify use cases. Oh, this is a good candidate to be recognized as something, as a separate use case. Now, another, by the way, distinction of like, how do you distinguish between two different use cases? Clearly, I think in the classical example, most likely you will have a very separate screens, right? So when the way you display the data, the way you allow user do things to the system, right? So like cancel sale is very different in appearance compared to logging off, right? So it just essentially it's two different things done in the system, two different things that are happening in the business object model, two different things happening in database updates and so forth. So obviously, these are absolutely distinct, and that's something that kind of drives our initial understanding that these will be our use cases, and so there should be kept separate, described separately, and perhaps implemented at different stages. Like for instance, log on will be a very high priority because you can't really do much without implementing the log on. Likewise, assign cashier is also a very high priority because again, you cannot log on unless someone has done assignment and so forth, right? So viewing this type of diagram also gives you like what is really a very high priority, something that needs to be done right away, otherwise we can't really make progress. Whereas the cancellation can be added later on, right? We want to perhaps play with and be able to do some basic sales, and then say, okay, now we can essentially work on the separate piece that deals with sale cancellations.